Have you ever wondered how big the internet is? In that moment, 8,500 tweets were tweeted. In that moment, 75,000 Google searches were performed. Just 3 neurons are needed for information-seeking behaviour. Even earthworms search the environment before taking a decisive action. The internet is used for learning every second of every day. People are probably even watching this on YouTube right now. But the trouble is, this is a world where fake news and miscommunication occur all the time. Think vaccinations, glyphosate, GM, pesticides. It's a world where the balance between information and disinformation shapes society. And this balance is much more delicate than you'd actually think. And I'd like to show you exactly what I mean. Now I'm going to show you 4 slides and just decide if the statement is likely to be true or false. Okay, that's it. So all the statements were true, but did you, like me, verify the soil and animal statement more quickly? You see, our thinking is biased towards the intuitive, which is why counterintuitive ideas can take an extra moment to remember learned information and correct that bias. Now, I'm giving a talk full of a room full of scientists. So can science training counteract this bias that we have? Well, the research says no. Even biology professors are slower and less accurate at verifying plants are alive relative to animals. It's intriguing how our minds work, isn't it? We'll do another set, as this result is particularly interesting. You ready? So did you, like me, reject the statements at different speeds? I bet you could reject this teleological statement faster than this statement, and some of you probably even got it wrong. There's no scientific basis. There's belief-type statements suggesting a purpose or function. The better the fit to purpose, the harder it is for us to process. Now that result's quite interesting. But what intrigued me is that education doesn't replace these beliefs, it enables people to repress them. Hence the 3-second time pressure reveals innate biases in our thinking towards meaning making. So thank you for joining in. You're now a rare group of people who can appreciate how delicate that balance is. It's not simply about approving education or transmitting more information as everyone thinks. We're all prone to thinking patterns that tip the balance towards disinformation. So we need to think much more carefully about communication. And technology has really ratcheted up this need. President tweets and stock markets react. People post things on Instagram and start global trends. And Facebook is now even employing journalists at local newspapers to try to combat fake news. But can you imagine what science would be like if we'd evolved and expanded with technology? So what really went wrong? Well, I started my PhD 15 years ago, and as students we were told to publish or perish to prove that we had impact. And it isn't that difficult, because when you have one idea and you try and answer one question, you end up with 10 more. By the time I moved on to a postdoc, it was an era of quality over quantity, which makes a lot of sense, but the reality can actually be quite different. Do you know there's even a board game you can buy called Lab Wars, where you compete for impact points, being a nurture paper, published book or Nobel Prize? It's a great stocking filler, but gives you an idea as to what sort of beliefs are about what it means to be a good scientist in the community. And the trouble is, when tackling sustainability issues, one can end up with a usability gap. What is usable science? Not only is it a community that does not necessarily have the skill set to tackle these issues, but there's a tension between what users and scientists mean by what's credible, relevant, and usable science. Now, I became a scientist because I was hoping to tackle some of these sustainability issues. And I had a number of frustrating postdocs where it was difficult to really do that. And I was actually on the cusp of leaving science when a fellowship opportunity came up, and I made my application and I was invited to an interview. And I wanted to know whether the investment I'd made for all those years, being the first member of my family to go to university, the publicly funded PhD, followed by moving to 3 countries for fixed-term postdocs, was actually going to amount to anything. And the interview was actually in the MRC building in London, up a lift to the 13th floor with a glorious view over London. The interview itself was in a windowless room, and you can picture it if you like. It was 5 academics sitting around a table with a spread of crisp white paperwork, ready for friendly but formal questioning about my project and ideas. And after about 30 minutes, we moved on to my plans for publications and impact. A routine question for a routine answer. But my answer caused a puzzled look across the interviewer's face. It was mentioned I should aspire to publishing in high-impact papers, and I disagreed. I said it should be open access, and that was my plan. And that caused more puzzled looks around the room and eyebrows raised. And I remember that moment for two reasons. Firstly, because I thought I'd blown it and things had gone quite well up until that point. And secondly, because I was okay with the outcome regardless. I'd rather be authentic and reject it than the alternative. Now, obviously, I was quite successful, and my fellowship gave me the opportunity to approach science a little bit differently, the freedom to do that. And it was actually during my fellowship that I had a light bulb moment that I'd like to share. But first, I need to tell you a little bit about the background so you can appreciate the significance of this breakthrough. Now, policymakers aspire to achieve sustainable soils by 2030, but the details are a little bit scant. The latest update indicates natural capital thinking will be used, and there's a one-year project that's ongoing to determine the indicators and management practices that will underpin policy. So logically, soil science is focused on indicators and management practices to align with policy ambitions. It was the starting point of my fellowship before I realised something. Policy is typically built on the assumption that people solely make economic decisions. However, it's a poor model for human behaviour. And this paper really did transform my understanding. It was discussing why the uptake of climate change mitigation actions was really quite limited. Essentially, behaviour is a trade-off between cooperation and self-interested behaviours, with a bias towards cooperation. So unfortunately, policies appealing to self-interested behaviours actually erode green self-identity, which erodes pro-environmental behaviours. The financial model of behaviour actually stems from politics, not science. It was particularly developed during President Clinton's era, which generated market-based ideas to manage the environment. The principal aim was to attract a powerful audience who were disinterested in the environment by integrating nature into the economy. So in this networked world, attracting an audience is no longer a problem. This political economy world approach persists with the belief that financial mechanisms will lead to sustainable management practices. Now, what policy is trying to achieve, and I have some nice pictures which will come up hopefully in a moment, is farmer behaviour changes after their previous policies that rewarded farmers for productivity. Scientists have found what it means to be a good farmer is associated with symbols and rituals that are associated with productivity goals. And I'd like to show you what these are. So, good farmer symbols. They're things like ploughing straight furrows, and they're things like growing food to its full potential. Policy changes towards environmental goals may cause a trade-off with productivity. For example, reducing tillage may benefit the environment but reduce food quality and quantity. So resistance to change is linked to the loss of potential self-identity. And it's not just of the individual, but it's also of the generations who've passed knowledge on, and of the community rituals such as ploughing matches and pub yield discussions. Now, what jolted me to my senses is that identity theory indicated that this can change if new visual symbols are developed about what it means to be a good farmer. And what ignited my curiosity is that there's a prestige bias in being the first one to adopt something new. And in a community where over-the-hedge learning or social learning is used is really important, it facilitates rapid uptake in the community. Now, this mechanism was first recognised in the 1930s by studying the uptake of innovations by farmers, and it led to the theory for the diffusion of innovations, a concept that underpins social media and how to start global trends. There's already an active social learning network led by farmers who put soils at the heart of their business. There are thought leaders and social media influencers on farms, popular events for farmers by farmers to facilitate ideas sharing and co-learning. Field labs are being established where scientists are invited to attend to help improve learning, and proactive groups of farmers who are actively out there seeking and sharing information. And this revelation was my light bulb moment. The system is there, I just need to be part of it and figure out what people are using as indicators of good soil management. The concept is the strategic use of science to help verify or myth-bust visual indicators of soil health to try and help with decision making. And the aspiration is that by working together, our collective intelligence should lead to substantial improvements in knowledge, more of a personalised medicine rather than prescriptive approach to field management. And this is a paradigm shift in thinking because scientists put themselves in the leadership role of sustainability efforts and direct sustainable action by farmers. But if you ask the farming community engaged in sustainable soils management, as Anna from the University of Sheffield has done, I'd like to quote this directly from her paper, which she published earlier this year. The leadership is coming from the farming community. The role of the scientific actors is to work with the farmers' sustainable soils management community and help them grow the community of practice by enhancing their learning and supporting their authority. So it seems like I was on the right track. Now, the latest development is the government's environmental land management scheme that's classified soil as a business asset, a private good. So it seems particularly important for scientists and farmers to explore new ways of working together to achieve sustainable soils. And I'm going to share with you the 3 pathways that I tried during my fellowship. It was where farmers helped me solve a problem, where I helped to solve an information gap for farmers, and together we were working to tackle a shared knowledge gap. Now, my starting point was listening and trying to discover what people used as the visual indicators of soil health to inform their management decisions. And it was things like the slaking test and earthworms. And this is a popular test that's used on farms all around the country. And it's very simple. People pour glasses of water into tubes, have a mesh in there, and then you just take your field of soil of interest and you pour it in, and you're looking for how much soil sort of rains down in that water. You see they behave slightly differently. And I appreciate it's quite difficult to see from the back, so I've put a picture here. So this is a YouTube video by the Innovation for Agriculture, which shows the bare soil you have more of a rain, whereas permanent pasture you have nice clear water. And the idea behind this is that soils with good organic matter quality resist disintegration. And disintegration or slaking indicates a risk of erodibility or capping, which may result in crop emergence issues, runoff issues and nitrate leaching. To cut a long story short, working with Chris and Andy and Joe and Yip and Mathilde, we'd actually generated a national database quantifying the slaking property by visiting farmers' fields and collecting samples, but also asking farmers to collect samples and bring them to us to analyse in our lab. And the results show that tilled arable and horticultural fields tend to slake and disintegrate under wetting, whereas the pasture fields are unlikely to slake or disintegrate. But we had a knowledge gap on no-tillage fields. We weren't sure whether they were going to fit closer to the pasture or closer to the arable settings, so that was one gap. And we investigated whether ploughing in organic matter would help, but after 5 years we still found no change and soils disintegrated under wetting. So this further provoked my interest in no-tillage. So, during my fellowship, the first thing I did was contact a manufacturer and arranged a no-till drill demonstration as the starting point for my fellowship field trial, a tentative step towards trying something new. And I invited the soils department to come along, but it was just myself and the farm team who were curious to investigate if this was going to work. So this is the planter, and it's just putting the seed straight in, and it doesn't disturb the soil at all. It's just cutting a slot and putting the seeds in. But unfortunately, in its first year, my experiment was ruined, which is a shame. Anyway, I put out a request for samples, and farmers attending Groundswell brought their soils to me to help fill this knowledge gap. And so I can show you the results. So here are all the samples in a range of different pots and containers, but we made them look quite nice. And what the answer showed is that 2 out of 10 ploughed fields resist disintegration and wetting, compared to 8 out of 10 no-till fields. So no-tillage management behaves much more like pasture fields than arable fields. So that's the survey, but I want to know a bit more about the science. What actually triggers that change in soil properties? Is this just random and spontaneous? Are there hotspots on fields where this change originates? And I'm specifically wondering about the actions of this tillage-sensitive earthworm, the lobworm. The lobworm comes out at night and makes middens that overlie their permanent burrow. And these are semi-permanent features on the soil surface, and they're known to be biological and chemical hotspots. Can they be physical hotspots too? So I took over the minimum tillage experiment at Rothamsted, and with the farmers' help, we converted it to no tillage. And the first experiment was taking soil samples from below the midden or from soil near to the midden, just to test and find out if there was a difference. And I won't keep you in suspense, the answer was yes. At aggregate scale and also at pore scale, we found that there were significant differences. So that was quite interesting, because on ploughed fields, these middens are rare, and on no tillage fields, these middens can cover up to 25% of the soil surface. So it seemed quite a novel discovery. So my first foray into co-participatory research was really quite good. I'd managed to fill a knowledge gap that I had, but also something unexpected happened. Now, when I asked for help from the farmers, I asked for soil samples. I asked for a pair of samples, one from the grassy edge as the positive control, and one from the field to give me an indication of management practices. My sampling compliance rate was just 64%. What people actually brought me was a scoop of soil from their field. They hopped over the hedge to the neighbour's field, who doesn't farm properly, and brought me a sample from their field too. So that was the learning moment, and that's something that I learned from this. Sometimes social learning is literally over the hedge, but it's very much curiosity driven. Now, I'm signalling a change in topic, and based on the average attention span, I suspect many of you will use this moment as a chance to let your mind wander until I say something that triggers your curiosity. And the primary function of curiosity is that it facilitates learning. And I have a little scientific insight that may help you to win more grant funding. A scientist called Zheng set up an experiment to better understand curiosity using trivia questions. And this led to the finding that curiosity is a U-shaped curve of confidence about knowing the answer to a question. People are most curious when they know a little bit about the answer but lack confidence. But what fascinated me is that under these circumstances, their curiosity is so great they're even willing to pay for information that could have been satiated for free after the test. Now, if you think about this in terms of grant funding, if people are confident a lot is known about a topic, there's no curiosity to find out more and it's unlikely to be funded. But if it's too new, there's no curiosity or compulsion to seek out the answer. The greatest curiosity is situations where information is partially but not fully encoded, and it's these situations that people are willing to pay for that information. Curiosity is a compulsion to alleviate the discomfort by the perceived gap in understanding, which triggers brain activity to facilitate learning and make it tractable. But learning from field trials is quite a difficult thing to do, as scientists were cautious to extrapolate the findings beyond the experimental conditions. Wouldn't it be great to strengthen that link to learning, though? There are a number of knowledge gaps in the sustainable soils management community, and the principal question that I'm always asked about is pesticides, which I actually studied during my PhD. However, there's a saying in science that publishing research on pesticides is like handing people a loaded gun and seeing what they're going to do with it. And I actually learned about this the hard way, not publishing, but the first talk I ever gave to farmers, I ended up talking about a rather controversial herbicide, because that's all what the questions are about. And I ended up trying to explain the results of a study which found reproductive effects on earthworms. However, I oversimplified the outcomes of this study, which led to a misunderstanding that spread, which I managed to correct by sending people the paper so they could read it for themselves and see what I was trying to get at. But a few people started to quote me, so then I had to track them down and apologise for causing misunderstanding. I'm very cautious to work in the world of pesticides. Anyway, the government abruptly banned metaldehyde-based slug pellets, leaving ferric-based pellets for fields, allotments, gardens, and either organic or conventional use. The problem is the only published studies on these pesticides indicate that metaldehyde has no effects on worms, but the ferric pellets had negative effects, including mortality responses. Now, members of the farming community were concerned, but they were told by the people selling the pellets that the products were worm-friendly since they changed the formulation. And publicly funded extension services have been cut. I received 22 requests for research on essentially the worm-friendliness of this policy decision by farmers. So I bit the bullet and I designed a replicated field-based study and laboratory test on the earthworm that's most likely to be sensitive to slug pellets. That deep burrowing worm that comes out and brings things into its burrow, it also can bring in 2 to 3 slug pellets an hour into its burrow. So that's what I based my study on. But a step that I took that's a little bit more unusual is I got feedback from the farming community on whether they understood my study and if the results actually answered their questions. Now, I had this presumption that only mortality-based responses would have been of interest to the farming community, but I was completely wrong. What we actually detected were temporary changes in feeding behaviour and subtle burrowing behaviour changes. And through a quiz at the end of the presentations I was giving, it was 3 groups of farmers to about 150 people in total. Farmers said they understood my study, but more importantly, they said the results would influence their decisions, including moderating use and investigating more integrated pest management strategies. And I think it was well received because I continued to receive a small stream of products they'd like further investigations based on things they've been told or rumours that spread in the community. So we have this nice trusted connection and safe space to learn about pesticides and pick up anything that's unexpected. The question is, what does it take to break trust? And is this something that we want to find out? Now, did anyone see this trend on Twitter last year? The coming earthworm apocalypse. Sounds quite bad, doesn't it? So if you click on the link, you find a blog post. It's a blog post written by a professor at a well-known university. And apparently 4 out of 5 earthworms have been killed off on fields. This is a cause for concern, isn't it? So I look at that paper, I find it down, it's open access. And here's the paper, and it's got nice impact metrics next to it. 2,500 people have downloaded and read this paper. 10,000 people have seen this abstract. And it's been seen all around the world. And it's not original data, it's based on other people's data sets. I wonder if you can see where I'm going with this. Do you want to know what data set they principally used? Yes, it was the electronic Rothamsted archive to generate this paper. the author did an analysis which was based on a broad box plot where he used the farmyard manure as the natural state of the soil to come up with this interpretation. And I'll show you the interpretation in a second. I'll leave you to read it while I have a sip of water. But thousands of people have read this. See, the study seems to have a lot of credibility. It's spread about by professors, it's peer-reviewed. But if anyone does scientific research, you'll be able to find my paper published 6 months previously, where we studied in duplicate every single plot on Broad Book, the continuous wheat, and we found no significant differences, but also no significant impact, I'm afraid. So the information's out there, but perhaps not in the right way. And I wanted to really understand where this belief comes from and how these beliefs spread. So I just did a simple thing. I just Googled Rothamsted and pesticides. And I hope it's not too controversial to share this because, well, you'll see how it is. One of the first things that one can come up with is this: erosion in national scientific capacity, where scientists warn the government of the impact of funding cuts in key areas such as environmental fate and behaviour of pesticides. And the absence of information is disastrous in this modern world, where things spread quickly and strengthen beliefs. So the best thing I could do is alert the scientific community to the risk that this sort of communication has. It's not just about worms and pesticides, it's a risk the foundation that social learning is built upon, trust. Now, one obvious way to try and tackle this problem is for scientists to re-engage policymakers. And scientists have resorted to pleas to policymakers to try and fund soils research by using modelling approaches to produce illustrative maps of what earthworm monitoring could look like at European scales. Now, there's rather a blank spot for England, isn't there? And considering Charles Darwin popularised earthworms with his book that outsold Origin of Species in his lifetime, it's rather a sad and depressing map. There are frustrations at global scales too for the lack of interest in soil biodiversity. Again, scientists are using modelling approaches and publishing papers in research journals to try and appeal to policymakers, showing this is what things could look like. And these authors cited a focus on soil bacteria, which is the problem. For example, even here in England, here is a recent policy note where earthworms are presented in the curiosity scale as knowns. Earthworm numbers can be used to indicate soil health. Can it? Is this an intuitive belief? Or is this actually science? No, I can't say I don't think soil microbiology isn't important. There's an imbalanced approach to understanding soil systems. Nobody knows what the optimal target is for earthworms, so configuring soil management practices are unknown. The knowledge gap is so large, we don't know whether it's optimal to have all 3 types of earthworms, as shown here. It's better to have 1 or 2 types of earthworms, but lots of different species. Or whether there's one type of species which is really important and really has a fundamental effect on soil systems. So why numbers of earthworms is believed to be a scientific unit is rather confusing. I think sometimes it comes down to the belief, because a lot of people are surprised to find out there's more than one type of earthworm. There are lots of different types of earthworms. In this country we have 29 different species of earthworms. We group them into different groups linked to their feeding and burrowing behaviours to provide some information on what happens in the environment. So whilst most scientists look to modellers to fill those knowledge gaps, I took a different approach. I thought that we could use co-participatory approaches managed through social media to try and bring together the sustainable soil management community. And the aspiration, or the idea is, we can be really coordinated as a community through online tools. And we can measure things at exactly the same time point, get a snapshot of soil biology. But by using the same method at the same time, we can do unprecedented scales, uncharted management practices, which is quite exciting. And that was the idea behind it, just testing this idea, is it possible? Now the method has to be accessible, it has to be something that everybody can do. And you see here, these are my tools. And remembering I used to run the LCITPMS, I've now converted myself to a spade, a mat, a pot for worms, a bottle, and something to note the results down upon. And actually, as a community, we've changed this method a little bit. We've moved away from a spade to a fork, because you chop less worms in half. Because I'm afraid that belief that when you chop a worm in half, you get 2 worms is mistaken. You get no worms at all. And it was all done online through wormscience.org, which is where I put everything, all the feedback I had from the farmers about doing some YouTube videos or worm quizzes to help with identification, all in one place. So it's freely accessible for us to move forwards. And the method can also be deployed on national field trials. There's no reason not to use it there, and it provides a pathway for picking up differences of environmental change through long-term strategic monitoring, which would be difficult to pick up through the responsive mode how farmers would use this test. And I actually asked participating farmers if they thought comparing their results to field trials like this would be useful, and 87% said yes. So that indicates these scientific resources provide an important pathway to strengthen community ties and information value. So I'm going to fast track us to the results. I just want to say that worms are ubiquitous. There's been a lot of random news stories about it, but worms are extremely common in our soils. What we're actually testing for is the type of worms in our fields. And to do that, you have to separate your adult worms from your juvenile worms. And so you're looking for the adults. Now, see, I bet from this picture you'd struggle to see what I'm talking about, but there's a very quick way. You just turn the one upside down, and it's much easier to spot the saddle. So that's what the farmers were doing. They were looking for their worms, separating out the adults, and then just simply typing them. And again, there's a common belief that the bigger the worm is, the more likely it is to be an adult. But that's not true. It's the presence of a saddle that's important. Adult earthworms can be smaller than a matchstick or bigger than a pen. It just depends on the type and the species of earthworm. Now, what the results showed is that 3 types of worms are common in only 4 out of 10 ploughed fields compared to 8 out of 10 no-till fields. So again, no tillage is sitting much more closely to pasture than conventional tillage, arable things. And this is in agreement with the scientific literature. And I benched all 61 locations and bits of Rothamsted during World Worm Week. And we are a conventionally tilled site focused on productivity, and we came out at 4 out of 10 too. Now, in terms of the earthworm community, which sort of worms are we not seeing in the community very often? And it's the deep burrowing earthworms. So 1 out of 5 fields, people weren't finding these worms. You're saying to me, oh, Jackie, they're deep burrowing. People just weren't digging very quickly or very well. But we were also looking for signs of these deep burrowers. We were looking for either their middens or the pen-shaped vertical burrows they make in the soil, those drainage channels. So people weren't finding the worms, the middens, or the drainage-type burrows that they make. So that could be a cause for concern, because these worms are really important for bringing in organic matter into the soil. And they also play a really important role for deep rooting and water moving through the system. And I was actually talking to someone from a water company last week at Groundswell, and he said they're beginning to think of earthworm activities as the start of their pipe network. And this is this picture here is something I took when I went to Canada. And they pour latex on the soil and let it drain through the burrows. And then you wait a couple of weeks and then you dig it out. So the burrows actually go much deeper than that, but people can't really dig that deeply. And you end up with this wonderful picture of what earthworms are doing in the soil. And you can imagine the water drainage, that sort of situation. So it was an open study. I released the study as a preprint during peer review, and it was published following corrections in the journal. But a miscommunication occurred, and I think this really did break the social learning contract. It spread misinformation about pesticides and farmers, and it potentially jeopardised future developments. And I really was quite furious that the data had been used to attack farmers in this way, because I need a situation where people can report depleted and exceptional populations, because that's how we learn something. And if that's not an environment that we can have, then there's no real point in doing any of this. And the main articles came out on the Saturday, and I was actually giving a farm talk on the Monday. It was down in Salisbury, which is usually a really nice drive, beautiful countryside, with the highlight being Stonehenge at the bottom. Instead of being a nice drive, I drove the whole way feeling really stressed, because I didn't know what reaction I was going to get to the farm when I arrived. I didn't know if it was going to be one of rejection, and people just seeing this sort of thing and going, we just don't want to be involved, or if I arrived and people were going to be hostile and I was going to have to weather the storm a bit. And I was expecting about 8 people to turn up, so when I drove up to the yard, there were 20 people. And I have to say, I approached them really quite sheepishly to see what the reaction was. But they were such a lovely group. They were just there to learn and find out more about soils and worms, and had heard about, earthworms, and had come specifically to do that. So my main stress was that I'd only taken 2 forks for all these people to go and do all this sampling and this analysis on these fields. We spent a really nice day comparing field management practices and the worms that were living in the soils beneath. So that worked really nicely. So I suppose what I learned from that experience is that in a world where fake news and alternative facts and beliefs and misunderstandings flourish, social learning builds trust and connects communities to the information that they seek. There's a fundamental difference between transmission and communication, and I think recognising this has never been more important in this modern world. And if I wanted to put my project in a picture, I suppose it might look a little bit more like this. I wonder if this networked world might need the evolution and expansion of science. In my own project, I've ventured into cognitive, psychological, social and agricultural soil sciences, working with the sustainable soil management community. The gaps in usable science include tackling intuitive beliefs, curiosity quenching knowns that are actually unknowns, and a body of soil health literature which itself is confounded by teleological statements. And I wonder how all this can be addressed in the current system, where policymakers lead and direct soils by trying to pay people to manage the environment, scientists lead and direct soils, searching for indicators and management practices to align with policy, and farmers lead and direct soils, using intuitive indicators on their own farms and shape the community of practice through social learning. The problem is, if policymakers consider themselves leaders and directors, scientists consider themselves leaders and directors, and the sustainable soil management community consider themselves leaders and directors, so you end up with a sort of situation where too many cooks. Now, a social learning model would look something more like this. It's where the sustainable soils community lead, scientists provide the service to support the learning and effective management practices, and policymakers subscribe to that service. It could create the environment that inspires and provokes curiosity, and the community working together towards a sustainable future. So we need them there, watering it all. Now, I know many of you worried that I did the wrong sort of science and I'm just a glorified knowledge exchanger, but that implies that there was knowledge to transmit. My project was actually about the co-creation of knowledge, spanning no-tillage, pesticides and earthworms. Big gaps in UK agriculture. It was connecting that information to those that sought it. And it's been quite an adventure. I've got to meet all sorts of interesting people and give them talks to thousands of others. And it's also been a huge learning curve. You know, my project is going to end up with about 9 papers currently under peer review, but I had to learn a whole load of other skills too. For example, I was using Twitter. I learned how to use Twitter and do online videos and editing and creating websites, something I'd never really done before. I took wormscience to the Science Museum, and I had grand ambitions of trying to inspire the public about contemporary agriculture. And what I learned is, what I was told by them, is all you have to do is get across that soils are alive, and that's sufficient for the public. I found out that farmers are really interested in their earthworms. In fact, earthworm populations would inform their management practices, and yet these are big knowledge gaps we have in science. I learned how to do desktop publishing, and I appreciate my designs might be a little cartoonish and gaudy, but it was reasonably effective. And actually, between the co-development and application phase, there was a 1,000% growth in participation. So it was taking off, it really was working. And then we did create a global snapshot of earthworm populations during World Worm Week. There was an entry from every non-ice continent in the world that took part. Quite exciting. And I appreciate this looks a bit amateur compared to those lovely digitally created modelling maps, but these were the real worms that people were finding we could compare. And if you remember nothing else from my talk, you now know what sort of worms live under banana plantations. So that's what, next time you have a banana, you can think about the soils beneath their feet. And the other interesting thing is that populations of worms in this site in India, and this banana plantation, were exactly the same as whose field spring barley at that moment in time. There we go. I also found that peer review is really slow and difficult to try and manage these sorts of projects. For doing the co-development of that method, I had to run along with an unvalidated method publicly to try and get enough data together to be able to assess whether that method was going to generate good quality data that was going to be useful and usable. So the strategy I deployed was wait until I had a minimum number of entries where I thought it could be judged. And then I sent a questionnaire out to 30 scientists, including all my biggest critics, to sort of provide a scientific consensus. And this wasn't a marketing-based activity. I put questions in that thing saying, no, the survey should be discontinued due to fundamental flaws, and things like that, just to try and draw out what the scientific community, where things could be improved or changed. And it's not to say it wasn't a relief that no one picked those options, but it was very encouraging. And actually, overall, 4 out of 5 scientists would recommend my worm test for farmers to use. But unfortunately, the other thing I learned was that 42% of scientists ranked this sort of activity as not at all useful or slightly useful to science or scientists. So that was disappointing. But I went down the alternative metrics route. I'm not really sure what they mean, but my pilot study was ranked quite well in terms of those sort of angles. But the press was a little mixed. I was a bit disappointed by the direction they went, but it was certainly talking to Waitrose magazine and Farmers Weekly, who took the time to actually talk with me, and we ended up with really nice, accurate articles that were really contributing to the social learning idea. It was very encouraging. There was apparently earthworm excitement. All these activities on earthworms, there was a demand for earthworm papers, which the European Journal of Soil Science made a special online issue, making all their most popular earthworm articles free for everyone to read for a period of time. So that was exciting. And then I learned how to write for non-scientific audiences. So I did this blog post for World Soils Day. There were 100,000 engagements and nearly 500,000 people read it. So that's pretty cool. I was really pleased with that. And then I've been approached by a publisher to write a children's book. So that's a very different skill set again. So now I'm learning how to write about wiggly worms and scuttling centipedes, which is quite different from the peer-reviewed articles that one normally creates. But overall, it really was a community experience. And I was very pleased that when the survey was talked about on Springwatch, they went down the citizen science side of things. So overall, I say it's been I'm not embarrassed to say it's been a labour of love trying to create my project and make it usable. It's been a huge amount of effort developing all these different skills to make it useful. But unfortunately, it's not the world that I live in. In fact, I went for a grant recently, and the reviewers provide their feedback. And 2 out of the 4 reviewers, after all of this, said high-impact papers are preferred. So it is what it is. So I come to the end of my fixed-term fellowship, and I just want to thank you for coming and listening to me today and letting me share my ideas and my project with you. I just want to leave with sort of one final thought. Since I started talking, there have been approximately 20 million tweets and 200,000 Google searches. And I just hope that the information is out there when they're looking for it. So thank you very much for listening here today, and thank you very much for listening if you're on YouTube, but thank you to everyone who made the project a success.